The year was 1895. A small English village lay shrouded in fog, its cobblestone streets damp with autumn rain. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Lanterns burned faintly in the night, as if afraid to illuminate what hid in the mist. And in the heart of this village, at the iron gates of the church graveyard, stood a girl whose name history would never forget, Sarah Whitmore. She was only 10 years old. Ordinary in appearance, yet strangely memorable. Her dark hair was tied with a ribbon, her pale face framed by the chill of November air. And most unsettling of all, her smile. It was not the playful grin of a child. It was something colder. Something out of place. There exists a photograph. A single image said to capture the very moment she stood at those gates. At first glance, it looks like countless other old photos from the Victorian age, sepia tones, blurred edges, a child dressed in Sunday best. But when you look closely, when you allow your eyes to linger on her expression, unease begins to settle. Her lips curve upward, but her eyes tell a different story. They do not shine with innocence. They reflect something hollow, something disturbing. Historians and collectors whisper of this image. They call it one of the most unsettling pieces of post-mortem photography ever discovered, though Sarah was still alive when it was taken. Others insist the photo shouldn't exist at all, as if it captured not just Sarah, but something standing behind her. Something you cannot quite see, but almost feel. This story is not just about a forgotten photograph. It is about the dark history surrounding a girl who should have been lost in time, yet remains frozen at the graveyard gates. A child who seemed to belong more to the dead than to the living. The Whitmore family was not wealthy, but they were respected. They attended church every Sunday, maintained their modest home, and appeared as though untouched by scandal. Yet, behind their windows, whispers suggested something was deeply wrong. The villagers often spoke in hushed tones about Sarah, her strange habits, her chilling presence, and her fascination with haunted places where no child belonged. It was said that Sarah spent hours at the graveyard, humming to herself, brushing her hand across gravestones, as if greeting old friends. The local children avoided her, afraid of the way she stared too long, afraid of the way she smiled when silence fell. Some believed she spoke in a forbidden language, one passed down in hushed tones by her mother. Others believed she was simply mad. But the truth, whatever it was, remained hidden. The photograph of Sarah at the graveyard gates spread quietly through the village, carried from family to family, until it became more than just an image. It became a warning. A disturbing image that seemed to carry with it a curse. Those who kept it reported strange knocks at night, cold drafts through closed rooms, and the faint sound of a child's laughter drifting from the shadows. At first, skeptics dismissed these accounts. They said it was mere coincidence, the imagination of a superstitious village. But as the years passed, more and more stories surfaced, too similar to ignore. A farmer who kept a copy of the photo awoke to find hoofprints circling his bed. A midwife claimed she saw Sarah standing at the foot of her stairs, smiling, though the girl had not been there. And one man, who dared to burn the photo, was found the next day, collapsed by the graveyard gates with the same hollow smile fixed upon his lips. Sarah Whitmore was no ordinary child. Her smile was no ordinary smile, and the photograph was no ordinary relic of the past. What makes this story endure is not only her eerie presence in that forgotten photograph, but also the chilling mystery of what followed. Sarah's fate was not written in church records, nor spoken of by her family. Her life became an unsolved mystery, her disappearance an unsettling history buried in silence. All that remains is the image, and the whispers that follow it. Look closely at that photograph. At first glance, it is ordinary, but the longer you stare, the more you notice the eerie details. The faint outline of a figure behind her shoulder. The way the iron gate seems darker near her hand. The way her shadow does not fall where it should. Sarah Whitmore stood at the graveyard gates in 1895. She smiled, and history trembled. What happened next would become one of the strangest, most disturbing mysteries of the Victorian age. The year was 1895, and the village of Cold Harrow seemed, at first glance, unremarkable. A cluster of stone cottages nestled among the rolling hills of rural England. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. Horses' hooves echoed against cobblestone streets. At dawn, the church bell tolled across mist-laden fields, calling villagers to prayer and labor. To an outsider, Cold Harrow might have appeared peaceful, untouched by the unrest of the wider world. But beneath the quiet routine, shadows lingered, and the Whitmore family stood at the heart of those whispers. Dark history is often not written in grand wars or sweeping revolutions. Sometimes it hides in forgotten events, in the smallest of places. And in this village, that hidden truth lived in the figure of a little girl, Sarah Whitmore. The Whitmores were a respectable family. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, was a stonemason whose hands shaped both hearths and headstones. Her mother, Margaret, was quiet, often seen gathering herbs at dusk along the hedgerows, though she seldom exchanged words with her neighbors. Their family home, a narrow two-story house, stood at the edge of the village, where the cobblestones ended and the path to the graveyard began. Some said that placement was no coincidence. Sarah, their only child, should have grown up like any other village girl, learning to stitch by candlelight, skipping stones along the river, playing games with other children in the lanes. But she did not. Instead, she was drawn to places most avoided, to the misty edges of the graveyard, to the ruins of the old mill where stories of haunted places kept even the boldest boys away. It was here, among these eerie places, that villagers noticed her unsettling habits. She lingered among graves long after church had ended. She sang old hymns, but in a strange cadence, as though reciting them in a forbidden language only she could understand. Sometimes, she placed ribbons and small objects at the graves of strangers, tokens no child could have known to bring. The other children kept their distance. They whispered that Sarah smiled at things no one else could see. They called her the graveyard girl. One boy swore he heard her laughing with someone behind the gates, though she stood alone. Another insisted she walked barefoot into the churchyard one night, humming as if she were answering a call from the dead. The adults noticed too, though they rarely spoke openly of it. Creepy storytelling traveled quietly, passed between neighbors at the baker's or whispered during the Sunday service. "That Whitmore child," they said, "doesn't look at you, she looks through you." But it wasn't only Sarah who unsettled the village. The Whitmore family itself seemed touched by something sinister. Margaret Whitmore's family, it was said, came from the north, where old superstitions lingered longer than in other places. Some swore her grandmother was once accused of speaking in a forbidden tongue, prayers not meant for Christian ears. Whether true or not, the association clung to them like smoke that would not lift. Even their home carried an air of unease. Its windows were often shuttered, even on bright days. And at night, neighbors claimed to hear a child's laughter carried on the wind, long after Sarah had been sent to bed. A sound too close to the graveyard gates to be a dream. Life in Cold Harrow moved slowly, but Sarah's presence became a ripple of disturbance, like a stone dropped into still water. Old photos of the village, preserved in fading albums, often capture gatherings, harvest festivals, church weddings, family portraits. Yet sharp-eyed historians notice something unsettling. In the background of more than one, a child stands apart from the crowd, pale, ribbon in her hair, smiling, always smiling. At first glance, the photographs seem ordinary. But when studied, they raise disturbing questions. Why does her shadow fall differently from others? Why does her gaze seem fixed not on the photographer, but beyond? These eerie details only deepen the mystery. By the autumn of 1895, Sarah's fascination with the graveyard had become the subject of constant discussion. Some said she was a child of God, with one foot already in heaven. Others believed she was touched by something darker, a chilling secret passed down through blood. And a few feared that she was no ordinary child at all, but something else, something that smiled at the gates because it belonged there. Cold Harrow was a village of habits and routine. Farmers tilled their fields, children fetched water from the pump, bells rang for service, as they always had. Yet, under this fragile normality, the story of Sarah Whitmore grew like a shadow no one could banish. Every whisper about her strange habits, every disturbing image of her pale face at the edge of a photograph, every eerie detail etched itself into the fabric of the village. The Whitmores said little. They guarded their daughter fiercely, answering questions with polite silence. Yet even their silence felt like a hidden truth, as though they carried knowledge too dreadful to speak aloud. Sarah Whitmore lived in a village that appeared ordinary, but her presence made Cold Harrow something else entirely. A place of unsettled history. A place where the line between the living and the dead blurred in ways no one dared to admit. The year was 1895. The village endured, but Sarah's smile lingered at the graveyard gates, and soon, very soon, that smile would mark the beginning of something far darker than anyone imagined. The year was 1895. Cameras were rare in Cold Harrow, owned only by the wealthier families or itinerant photographers who traveled from town to town. Yet one such man, an outsider carrying his heavy tripod and glass plates, arrived in the village that autumn. His intention was simple: to capture portraits of families and children, the kind that would become treasured heirlooms, faces frozen in time. He had no idea that among the faces he would capture was one that would haunt history forever. That was the day Sarah Whitmore stood at the graveyard gates, ribbon tied neatly in her hair, wearing her best Sunday dress. The photograph was taken quickly, almost carelessly, as if she had been waiting for it. The click of the shutter seemed to seal something far more sinister than a child's likeness onto the plate. At first glance, the image looked ordinary. A little girl, pale and thin, smiling faintly at the camera. Behind her, the iron gates rose tall and black against the mist. The photo was kept in a simple case, and like countless other old photos, it should have faded into obscurity. But this one drew the eye and refused to let go. Look closely, and you notice the unsettling details. Sarah's smile is wrong, too deliberate, too knowing. Her eyes, unblinking, do not look at the photographer but slightly past him, as though fixed on something just beyond the frame. And then, just behind her left shoulder, there is the blur of a figure. Faded. Incomplete. Almost human, but not. Some say it was only a trick of light. Others insist it was something far more sinister. Historians call this one of the most disturbing images of the Victorian era. Collectors whisper that it belongs in the dark archives of post-mortem photography, though Sarah was alive when it was captured. That contradiction unsettled everyone who studied it. Why did the image carry the same heavy aura as those portraits of the dead, staged lovingly in parlors to preserve the memory of children who had already vanished from the world? Why did Sarah's living smile resemble the stiff, unnatural grin of the lifeless? Villagers who saw the photograph swore it carried a curse. Those who kept a copy reported strange happenings. Doors unlocking themselves at night, the sound of a child humming near their windows, cold drafts slipping beneath doors though the fires still roared. One woman claimed she saw Sarah's face in her mirror, smiling behind her own reflection. Another found the photograph moved from her mantel to the edge of her bed, though no one in the house admitted to touching it. The photographer himself, a man named Elias Cartwright, left Cold Harrow soon after. He was unsettled by the image he had taken. Weeks later, he was discovered dead in a boarding house in the next town. The official cause was illness, but those who viewed the body reported that his face bore an eerie expression, a fixed, hollow smile. The photograph survived him. Passed quietly from hand to hand, hidden inside drawers, whispered about like a forbidden relic. Some believed it captured the very moment Sarah began her descent into mystery. Others claimed it was proof of something darker, that she was never meant to be photographed at all. To this day, only fragments of the original print remain, hidden in private collections. Grainy reproductions circulate among enthusiasts of unsettling history, each one carrying with it that same disturbing detail: the blurred figure, the strange smile, the absence of a proper shadow beneath Sarah's feet. What makes this photograph different from other disturbing images of the Victorian age is not only what it shows, but what it suggests. The eerie details speak of something unseen, a hidden truth behind the Whitmore family, a connection between Sarah and the graveyard that even time cannot explain. Unsolved mysteries often cling to objects, a diary, a painting, an old photo, but few are as haunting as this one, where the subject herself would soon vanish from history, leaving only the smile and the gate behind her. The villagers grew uneasy. Some refused to look at the image at all. They said to stare too long at Sarah's eyes was to invite her into your thoughts. And those who lingered always felt the same, like a faint pressure at the back of the room, like someone small and silent watching from the corner. Was it only superstition? Was it simply the eerie effect of Victorian photography, with its long exposures and blurred edges? Or was there something more, a presence that slipped into the frame that day, eager to be remembered? Sarah Whitmore stood smiling at the graveyard gates in 1895, captured forever in a single disturbing image. That photograph should not exist. Yet it does. And it remains one of the most chilling secrets of Cold Harrow's sinister past. But the photograph was only the beginning. The whispers that followed would lead to something far more disturbing, something that would make villagers question whether Sarah belonged to the living at all. The year was 1895, and by now Sarah Whitmore had become more than just a curious child at the edge of the graveyard. She had become a presence. An unsettling reminder that sometimes the boundaries between the living and the dead are not as firm as we believe. Villagers began to speak of her habits in whispers. They said Sarah was never truly alone, that she was always in conversation with someone or something that could not be seen. On quiet afternoons, she would wander between the gravestones, pausing as if listening. Then, without warning, she would tilt her head, smile faintly, and whisper words into the cold air. At first, people thought it was a child's imagination, pretend friends, make-believe stories. But the longer they watched, the more disturbing it became. She was not speaking in playful tones. Her words were hushed, deliberate, careful, as though she were repeating a forbidden language learned in secret. No one could make out the syllables, but villagers swore they did not sound like English. One gravedigger, an older man named Robert Hayes, claimed he once overheard her near a freshly dug plot. She was speaking soft, like a prayer, he told the innkeeper. But it wasn't the Lord's Prayer. It was something else. Something older. When I called out to her, she turned and smiled, but her lips kept moving. Like the words weren't meant for me. Like they weren't meant for anyone living. Children began avoiding the graveyard entirely. It wasn't just her presence that frightened them. It was the laughter. A soft giggle that carried on the wind, even when no one was there. Some said Sarah laughed with companions the rest of the village couldn't see. Others said she was answering voices that called to her from beneath the ground. The local schoolmistress, Miss Fletcher, once caught Sarah standing outside the classroom window during lessons. The child wasn't trying to get in. She was staring past the teacher's desk, her lips moving as if in conversation. It was the strangest thing, Miss Fletcher later wrote in her journal. Her eyes weren't on me or on the students. They were fixed on the empty chair at the back of the room. And when I called her name, she didn't flinch. She simply smiled, as though whoever sat in that chair had told her something I could not hear. It was not only children and teachers who felt her presence. Adults, too, grew uneasy. At night, villagers reported seeing Sarah at the graveyard gates, her figure framed in the pale glow of the moon. Some said she carried a candle, though no flame burned upon it. Others swore her shadow was absent, as though she stood without weight or form. These encounters began to take a toll. Families who lived closest to the churchyard started moving away, leaving their homes empty, shutters drawn tight. The innkeeper's wife insisted she heard Sarah humming in the stairwell one night, though the child had never entered the inn. And one farmer, passing the graveyard at dusk, claimed he saw not one girl but three, Sarah, and two shadowy figures standing beside her. The photograph, too, only deepened the fear. People began to connect the blurred shape behind her with these whispered sightings. Was the image proof of her invisible companions? Or was it something darker, spirits bound to her in some secret way? The Whitmore family remained silent. They neither confirmed nor denied the rumors, but their silence only fed the fear. Neighbors wondered if the family themselves knew what Sarah was communing with. Some even suspected they encouraged it, that the Whitmores were not victims of Sarah's strange behavior, but keepers of a chilling secret. Soon, Sarah was no longer invited to gatherings. No one wanted her near their children. The village avoided her, and yet she was always there, drifting silently between the church and the graves, smiling at something just out of sight. And then came the testimonies that made the whispers harder to dismiss. The sexton of the church claimed he once found Sarah kneeling at a grave long past midnight. He described her speaking in a voice not her own, a low, hollow tone that sent a chill through his bones. When he asked what she was doing, she turned to him, smiled sweetly, and said, "They're teaching me." The sexton never returned to the graveyard at night again. Sarah Whitmore had become an unsolved mystery in her own lifetime. Was she a child of innocence drawn to places of sorrow? Or was she something else? A vessel for voices that should have remained silent, an open door to a haunted place where the living did not belong. By the end of 1895, the whispers had grown too many to ignore. People began to fear that Sarah's connection with the dead was no mere childhood fancy. It was something real, something dangerous. And soon, something would happen that would make her name unforgettable. The year was 1895, and while the villagers of Cold Harrow whispered about Sarah Whitmore, her family spoke of her rarely, if ever. The Whitmores moved through life as though the child's strange habits were invisible, as though the eerie details everyone else saw did not exist. Her father, Thomas, was a man of stone, literally and figuratively. He carved headstones for the dead with precision, his hands shaping grief into permanence. Some said he worked long hours to avoid going home. Others swore they saw him speaking quietly to the graves he carved, as if he, too, knew of voices no one else could hear. Her mother, Margaret, was more unsettling still. She was often seen gathering herbs by the hedgerows, plants the villagers called by their darker names: foxglove, belladonna, monkshood. When asked, she would say they were for medicine, but the women in the village whispered of something else. Of charms, of remedies not taught by doctors, but passed down through forbidden language, old words never spoken in church. The Whitmore house reflected their silence. Shutters drawn tight even in summer. Curtains never fully opened. Inside, faint lamplight flickered through lace, but no laughter spilled out. No warmth of family life. Neighbors claimed they heard chanting at odd hours, low voices that did not belong to Thomas or Margaret. And when asked about Sarah's strange habits, the Whitmores would only nod politely and change the subject. That silence, more than anything, frightened the village. It was one thing to have a child who wandered the graveyard. It was another to have parents who accepted it without question. Some believed the family encouraged it, that Sarah was being raised not as a daughter, but as a vessel for something older, something hidden. An old record found years later, a letter tucked into the parish archives, suggests that even the vicar grew uneasy. He wrote of visiting the Whitmore home after Sarah had been seen standing by the churchyard gates past midnight. Inside, he found Margaret seated at the table, her hands folded neatly. Sarah sat beside her, smiling faintly, her eyes fixed not on the vicar, but on the empty chair across from her. When he asked Thomas about her behavior, the man's reply was chilling in its simplicity. "She listens better than most." The vicar left quickly and never returned after nightfall. The Whitmores never sought help for Sarah, never asked the doctor to examine her, never asked the priest to pray for her soul. Instead, they lived as if nothing were wrong. Yet, behind that facade of normality, eerie details piled higher with each passing week. Visitors who entered their home described an unsettling stillness. Family portraits lined the walls, but in several, Sarah's face appeared blurred, as though the camera refused to capture her fully. In one photo of the Whitmores at their dining table, Sarah is absent altogether, yet in the reflection of the glass cabinet behind them, her figure is faintly visible, smiling at the camera. The silence of the family became its own form of horror storytelling. Neighbors invented theories. Some claimed the Whitmores were bound by a curse. Others believed Sarah was not their biological child, but a child of the dead, left at their door and raised in secrecy. A more chilling rumor suggested that Margaret had lost another child years earlier, and that Sarah was the replacement, an echo of the one who had vanished. Dark history often hides in families that refuse to speak, and the Whitmores' silence seemed to grow heavier the more Sarah's mystery deepened. People began to watch their home with suspicion. Some avoided passing it altogether, taking longer routes to church rather than walk by the shutters of that narrow house. One testimony, recorded decades later, came from a maid who had worked briefly for the family. She claimed she once entered Sarah's room and found the child sitting cross-legged on the floor, whispering to a row of small stones arranged in perfect order. When the maid asked what she was doing, Sarah replied, "They're listening. They always listen." The maid left the house the very next morning. The Whitmores never explained, never defended themselves. They let the village gossip grow, like ivy crawling up old stone. But their silence was not peace, it was complicity. And by the end of 1895, when Sarah's visits to the graveyard became longer, when her whispers to the dead grew bolder, the villagers began to suspect that the Whitmores knew what was coming, that they had always known. The family's silence was not ignorance. It was consent. And that silence would echo louder than any scream when Sarah Whitmore finally vanished. The year was 1895. The autumn winds swept through Cold Harrow, rattling the iron gates of the graveyard where Sarah Whitmore was most often seen. The nights grew colder, and with them, the whispers about the girl grew darker. Villagers spoke of her smile, always the same faint curve of the lips, as if she knew something no living soul should know. By October, Sarah had become a fixture at the graveyard gates. At first glance, it seemed like a child's odd pastime. But when neighbors looked closer, they realized she was not simply standing there. She was waiting, watching, listening, and sometimes she was speaking to no one visible. One evening, a group of children passing the churchyard claimed they saw her seated upon the gate itself, balanced with unnatural stillness. Her eyes, they swore, were not fixed on them, but on something in the mist that no one else could see. When they called her name, she turned, smiled, and whispered a phrase none of them could understand. They ran, terrified, never repeating the words aloud. Some believed it was a forbidden language, a tongue older than the village itself. It was on the night of November 3, 1895, that Sarah Whitmore disappeared. The story begins in the early evening, when she was last seen by the sexton, Mr. Hollis, carrying a small lantern. She walked past him without a word, her thin figure vanishing through the mist as she made her way to the graveyard gates. Hollis assumed her parents would fetch her later, as they often did, or perhaps that they never would. But when morning came, Sarah was gone. The lantern lay extinguished at the gate. Its glass was cracked, as if it had been dropped suddenly. The iron bars bore faint scratches, marks that looked disturbingly like fingernails dragged across the surface. Her parents gave no cry of alarm. Thomas Whitmore went about his work at the stonecutter's yard. Margaret, pale but composed, told neighbors only, "She is not lost. She is where she belongs." The villagers were horrified. Search parties combed the woods, the riverbanks, and the churchyard itself. Old wells were checked. Abandoned cottages were pried open, but Sarah had vanished without trace. Not a shoe, not a ribbon from her hair. Only that broken lantern and the eerie silence of the Whitmore family remained. Rumors multiplied. Some swore they saw Sarah in the nights that followed, her figure drifting among the headstones, her smile faint in the moonlight. Others claimed to hear her voice, soft, childlike, calling from behind the walls of the crypt. "Come play," it said. "It's safe here." One man, desperate to prove these tales false, lingered near the gates after dark. He later told the parish constable that he heard a faint humming, a nursery rhyme, one he had not heard since his own childhood. The sound grew louder until it seemed to surround him, though no one was there. He ran home trembling, refusing to repeat the tune. The Whitmores, meanwhile, remained silent. They gave no help to the searches, no tears to comfort the grieving. Instead, they locked their doors and drew their curtains. Some said they had been expecting this all along, that Sarah's disappearance was not an accident, but a fulfillment of some hidden truth. Weeks passed, and yet Sarah did not return. The villagers began to fear that she had been claimed, not by human hands, but by the very dead she had smiled upon, that her strange affinity for the graveyard had not been childish curiosity, but an invitation to something sinister. Dark history has many tales of vanished children. But what made Sarah's disappearance so unsettling were the eerie details that clung to it like cobwebs. The broken lantern, the fingernail scratches, the whispered phrase none dared repeat, and the silence of her parents, who mourned nothing. By December, snow covered Cold Harrow, and the search ended. Yet still, at dusk, villagers avoided the churchyard path, for on certain evenings they swore they saw the faint glow of a lantern at the gates, and within that glow, the outline of a small girl, smiling, waiting for someone to approach. Sarah Whitmore was gone, but her presence lingered, like the chill of a grave left open. The year was 1895. Winter had come to Cold Harrow, burying the crooked lanes in a silence almost as heavy as the Whitmore family's own. Sarah was gone, vanished without a trace. And yet, within weeks, the villagers found themselves summoned to a funeral. There was no body, no coffin carried through the snow, only a gathering of uneasy faces in the parish church, lit by flickering candles that threw long shadows across the stone floor. The vicar himself seemed uncertain, his words halting, as though he knew the ritual was incomplete. A funeral without a corpse was not a funeral at all, but a performance of grief, one that left the living more unsettled than consoled. The Whitmores arrived dressed in black. Thomas stood rigid, his face as expressionless as the monuments he carved. Margaret's eyes remained fixed downward, her hands folded too neatly, her lips pressed tight, as if holding back words no one should hear. Neither shed a tear. Neither spoke of their daughter. Their silence was louder than any hymn. The church smelled of damp wood and melting wax. Outside, the graveyard gates creaked in the wind, and some swore they heard the faintest laughter carried on the air. The villagers dared not mention it aloud, for fear that naming it would make it real. When the vicar spoke Sarah's name, a candle near the altar sputtered and went out. Darkness bloomed briefly before another flame was lit, but by then, several villagers had already crossed themselves. It was not the act of God they feared, but the act of something else, something hidden in the shadows of the church. What disturbed the congregation most was the placement of the service. The Whitmores insisted it be held not only in the church, but with the doors open to the graveyard beyond. As the prayers were read, the villagers could see the rows of crooked headstones, dusted in snow, like silent witnesses to the ritual. The gates where Sarah once stood seemed to beckon, their iron bars gleaming faintly in the candlelight. When the service ended, the vicar prepared to close the book. But Thomas Whitmore interrupted. His voice was calm, steady, but his words cut through the silence like a blade. "She is not gone, she is here." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret only nodded, her eyes glinting as if in agreement. No more was said. The family turned and left the church without speaking to anyone. That night, the villagers whispered of the funeral with growing unease. A service without a body was already troubling, but Thomas's words lingered in every mind. "She is not gone. She is here." Did he mean Sarah's spirit remained among them, or that she was alive somewhere, hidden by her own family? Some claimed to see signs in the days that followed. Disturbing images began to circulate, photographs taken of the graveyard during the funeral. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Rows of mourners, the open gates, the snow-covered stones. But in the corner of one image, barely visible, a small figure seemed to stand. A child, half obscured by mist, her mouth curled into that same faint smile. Many dismissed it as a trick of the light. But others, staring longer, whispered that the figure was Sarah herself. The Whitmores never addressed the photograph. They never explained why they held a funeral without proof of death. Their silence became another layer of the mystery, a void into which the villagers poured their fears. Some wondered if the family's strange rituals had gone too far, if Sarah's disappearance was tied to the forbidden language Margaret was said to mutter at night, or the headstones Thomas carved as though speaking with the dead. Others feared that the funeral itself was not a farewell, but an invitation, a way of binding Sarah not to the living, nor to the dead, but to something in between. One detail, recorded later in the parish log, chilled researchers most of all. When asked where Sarah's grave should be marked, Thomas Whitmore gave no instruction. No stone was carved. No earth was turned. The vicar wrote a single line in frustration. "There is no grave, for there is no body." Only silence. The villagers left the church uneasy that day, believing the matter far from over. For how could there be closure when no child had been laid to rest? Sarah Whitmore had vanished, yet the funeral without a body only deepened the mystery. The Whitmores had closed a chapter in silence, but the villagers felt something else had been opened, something that would not remain buried. The year was 1896. Nearly a year had passed since Sarah Whitmore vanished, and the funeral without a body had left the village of Cold Harrow restless. Rumors lingered like smoke, and silence wrapped itself around the Whitmore house. But then, two objects surfaced, two small, ordinary things that should have brought comfort. Instead, they opened doors to something far darker. The first was a diary. It was discovered by accident, wedged beneath a loose floorboard in the vestry of the church. No one knew how it had been placed there, or by whom. Its cover was worn, its pages stained with damp. The handwriting within, however, was unmistakable. It belonged to a child. The diary contained fragments, half-sentences, incomplete thoughts, and eerie details written with the shaky hand of a young girl. At first, it seemed innocent. Notes about flowers in the churchyard, birds that perched on the gravestones, the sound of bells at dusk. But then the entries grew darker. She began writing about voices that spoke from the ground, about children no one else could see, about the lady in the veil, who stood by the gates at night and told her secrets the living should never know. One passage, dated just weeks before Sarah's disappearance, read, "Tonight," she said, "my smile opens the gate. When I smile, they smile back. When I stop, they grow angry. So I must always smile." The villagers who read these words whispered in horror. Was this the voice of a child slipping into madness? Or had Sarah been telling the truth all along, that something in the graveyard answered her? The second object was smaller, yet more disturbing still. A ribbon, pale blue, frayed at the edges. It was found tangled in the iron bars of the graveyard gate, long after the snow had melted. At first, no one thought much of it, until the vicar's wife recognized it. She swore she had tied that very ribbon into Sarah's hair only days before the girl disappeared. The ribbon seemed almost preserved, untouched by weather, as though it had been placed there deliberately. When held in hand, some claimed it smelled faintly of earth, not fresh soil, but the stale, airless scent of something buried. Together, the diary and the ribbon painted a picture more chilling than any rumor. The diary gave Sarah a voice beyond the grave. The ribbon gave proof that she had stood at those gates in her final hours. But what neither gave was closure. Instead, they raised more questions. How did the diary find its way beneath the church floorboards? Who placed it there? Why did the ribbon remain intact, as though shielded from decay? And most disturbingly, why did the final page of the diary end with words written in a hand that did not seem like Sarah's at all? That last entry, written in darker ink, read, "She smiles still. She is not gone. She waits." The handwriting was jagged, uneven, almost frantic. It bore little resemblance to Sarah's careful scrawl. Some thought it was her father's hand, others her mother's. But no one dared ask the Whitmores. The family, as always, kept their silence. The villagers grew uneasy once more. They spoke of the diary as though it were cursed, passing it from hand to hand, but never keeping it long. Those who read too much claimed to hear faint scratching at their windows at night, or the sound of a child humming a lullaby just beyond their doors. and the ribbon, some swore it moved when left alone, that its ends curled and twisted like something alive. It was eventually locked away in a small box in the parish, where no one dared touch it again. The diary and the ribbon should have been relics of remembrance. Instead, they became artifacts of fear, symbols of a child lost not to time, but to something far more sinister. They hinted at a truth no one wanted to face, that Sarah Whitmore's story was not finished. And with each whispered reading of her words, with each glance at the pale blue ribbon, the village of Cold Harrow began to wonder, had the girl who smiled at the graveyard gates truly disappeared? Or had she only crossed into a place where the living were never meant to follow? The year was 1897. 2 winters had passed since Sarah Whitmore vanished, and yet her presence still hung over Cold Harrow like a veil of frost that never melted. The diary and the ribbon had only deepened the unease. Villagers no longer spoke of her as a missing child. They spoke of her as something else entirely, an echo that refused to fade. Every village has its legends, born from dark history and whispered to frighten children. But Sarah's story was different. It was not a tale passed down through centuries. It was recent, raw, and terrifyingly alive. She was not a ghost from long ago. She was a child the villagers had seen with their own eyes. A girl who had smiled at the graveyard gates and then disappeared. The legends began almost immediately after the funeral without a body. Some claimed Sarah still wandered among the graves at dusk, her pale blue ribbon tied neatly in her hair. Others swore she was heard singing nursery rhymes in the fog, her voice carried by the wind, thin and sweet. One farmer said his youngest son awoke one night to find Sarah standing at the foot of his bed, smiling silently before vanishing into the dark. At first, these were dismissed as dreams or tricks of the mind. But as the years crept on, more and more accounts surfaced, and disturbingly, the details were always the same. The faint smile, the pale ribbon, the sense that Sarah was waiting. In time, Sarah Whitmore became less a child of memory and more a figure of horror storytelling. Parents warned their children not to linger near the churchyard gates. They told them not to smile at the graves, for fear that she might smile back. Even travelers passing through Cold Harrow felt it. They wrote in diaries of the strange chill around the church, of seeing a little girl's shadow flicker against the stone though no child was there. The old photograph from the funeral resurfaced, passed around like contraband. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. But those who stared too long claimed the faint figure in the mist grew clearer over time, as though the image itself was alive. Some swore her smile widened with each viewing. By then, Sarah was no longer just a missing girl. She was a legend that refused to die. The villagers stopped asking whether she was alive or dead. They began to fear she existed in some state beyond either. Strange families traveling through Cold Harrow began to speak of her as if they had heard the tale elsewhere, as though Sarah's legend had already spread beyond the village. A haunting whispered in inns and market squares, retold by strangers who should not have known her name. That was the unsettling history of Sarah Whitmore. She was no longer simply a child of Cold Harrow. She had become a story that traveled. But legends, once born, have power. And Sarah's legend seemed to feed upon itself. The more it was spoken, the stronger it became. Even those who scoffed at ghost stories admitted that certain nights in the village carried a weight, a stillness, as if the air itself was listening. And in that silence, some heard faint laughter. There were those who believed the Whitmores had wanted this, that their silence, their refusal to grieve, had not been born of shock, but of devotion, that Sarah's disappearance was not tragedy, but transformation. A child given to something beyond human understanding, to carry a message in a forbidden language spoken only by the dead. Dark history has always blurred the line between fact and myth, and Cold Harrow became the perfect breeding ground for both. Villagers kept their shutters drawn tighter. Travelers crossed themselves when passing the churchyard, and all the while, the iron gates where Sarah had once stood grew rusted with age, but never lost their pull. By 1897, Sarah Whitmore was no longer just a child who vanished. She was a warning. A reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved, and some voices never meant to be silenced. For in Cold Harrow, they still whispered that if you lingered too long by the graveyard gates, if you smiled at the headstones in the right light of dusk, you might hear a voice behind you. Small, soft, familiar, and when you turned, she would be there, Sarah Whitmore, the girl who smiled and never stopped smiling. The year was 1899. 4 years had passed since Sarah Whitmore was last seen at the graveyard gates of Cold Harrow. Time had weathered the village, as it always does, but Sarah's absence remained untouched by age. She had not returned, yet she had never truly gone. Her legend had taken root, growing like ivy across stone, tightening its grip on memory until it was impossible to separate fact from myth. The diary was locked away, the ribbon hidden, the photograph buried in drawers where no one dared display it. And yet, these relics never lost their power. Each whispered retelling of Sarah's story carried the same weight as those fragile objects, small things, ordinary things, that should not disturb us. But they did. Because each of them reminded the living of one thing: Sarah Whitmore had not found rest. Her parents never spoke of her again. The Whitmores themselves seemed to fade into shadows. By 1898, their shutters closed permanently, their garden untended, their hearths cold. Some said they left the village in the dead of night. Others whispered they still lived in the house, silent, waiting for their daughter to return. No one dared knock to find out. But Cold Harrow did not need their answers. The village had already decided its truth. Sarah had not vanished. She had crossed. And so, the legend of the girl who smiled at the graveyard gates became a part of the land itself. Children grew up hearing her name whispered like a curse. Travelers arrived curious and left uneasy. And through it all, the churchyard stood, its iron gates rusting but never silent, as though listening for the faint laughter of a child. It is here that the line between history and horror storytelling dissolves. On paper, Sarah Whitmore was just another child lost to time, a missing girl from 1895 whose body was never found. But stories are more enduring than flesh. And when the story is one of eerie details, of vanished children, of silence and smiles, it becomes something else entirely, something that lingers, something that refuses to die. For even now, the legend persists. Some say that on cold evenings, when the mist rolls through the village, you can still see her by the gates. That faint, unbroken smile. That pale blue ribbon caught in the wind. And if you are foolish enough to meet her eyes, if you dare to smile back, then you, too, may never return. Dark history does not always leave monuments. Sometimes, it leaves whispers. Sometimes, it leaves faces in old photographs. Sometimes, it leaves only the memory of a child who should have been forgotten but never was. And Sarah Whitmore remains one of those memories. A girl lost in time. A girl who listened to the dead. A girl whose story became a forbidden language the living repeat only in hushed tones. The girl who smiled at the graveyard gates. And still smiles, waiting. So, when you find yourself near an old churchyard, and the wind rattles the iron bars, do not linger. Do not turn. Do not smile. For legends that never die are always watching, because Sarah Whitmore is not gone. She is here, and she is waiting for you. This was the story of Sarah Whitmore, the girl who smiled at the graveyard gates, one of many unsettling histories lost in time, where innocence meets the shadows of the past. And if you listen closely, perhaps too closely, you might hear her smile, even now. Sleep well. If you can't,